but I've got to tell you, I'm probably not going to get parole. And the reason I'm not going to get parole is because to get parole, you have to express remorse for the crime. And I can't express remorse for a crime I didn't commit. And the words he ended this passage with are, he said, "Truth is more important to me than my freedom."
So now let's go from that beautiful scene you just related. 2021, Ben walks out of prison with Deborah hand in hand. There's a press conference. The crowd parts and the music rises. No, that would be in the movie. But there's actually more. There was one last battle to be fought. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. He was still considered a convicted murderer in the eyes of the law until he is exonerated, until the Court of Criminal Appeals agrees that he didn't get a fair trial. He's basically on probation. I mean, he's got this Damocles sword hanging over them. Remember, this is the court that rejected the finding earlier. And now they have to reconsider a new finding that he didn't get a fair trial and decide whether they believe it or not, whether they agree or not. So they wait in between. They wait 3 years. In between, Ben and Deborah get married, which I can tell you about. But they wait 3 years. And finally, in May of 2024, they decide that, yes, Ben did not get a fair trial. The beauty of the legal strategy is that the decision about what to do with Ben next was left up to the DA, John Creuzot. So he had to decide whether to try Ben again. And he often said he wouldn't do that. There wasn't the evidence. To dismiss the charges or dismiss the charges in the interest of justice, which means that we don't have enough evidence to convict or to acquit. It's kind of neutral. Or to dismiss the charges based on innocence. And we didn't know what he would do because it's still a high standard. So the summer goes along and the DA does everything he can to try to make this ironclad. Like he sends his prosecutor, Cynthia Garza, down to talk to Michael Hubbard and give him use immunity if he will confess to this. Michael Hubbard said he won't talk to them. So they tried everything they could to get it ironclad. And it didn't. It just was going to be a judgment call. And so on August 29th of 2024, I was there. So were a lot of other people. He has a hearing. And the hearing is in the same room that Ben was convicted twice and released once, found that he didn't get a fair trial once. There, again, hundreds of people have shown up. And the courtroom only holds 80 people. 200 people crowd in. The judge has to kick out, most of them. And it's just electric because we don't know really what the judge is going to do.
And what hinges on this decision?
We don't know what the prosecutor is going to do. And what hinges on it, it's a judgment, really, because there's no dispositive evidence that someone else did this crime. There's tons of evidence to show that Ben was unfairly convicted and tons of evidence to show that he really had nothing to do with it. Nothing touched him. No forensic evidence. The evidence all fell apart. There was nothing. He had alibis. But it was still, there wasn't anything dispositive. There wasn't any physical evidence or a Michael Hubbard confessing to it. And so it was a judgment call. And what happened is Cynthia Garza stands up and she begins to talk about how there's no evidence against Ben. And for this reason, they want to dismiss the charges based on innocence. And then her voice cracks because she's been neck deep in the investigation and she's met with Ben and knows him and knows what kind of person he is. And she says, "Mr. Spencer, on behalf of the state of Texas, I want to apologize for the terrible injustice that's been done to you." And she can barely get the words out. And then she walks over and she's crying and he's crying and they hug. And then the judge who's sitting up there at her bench, Leela Mays, talked about all that went wrong and the problems in the system. And then she says, I'm going to do something now, Mr. Spencer. I'm going to come down and I'm going to stand in front of you. And she comes down and she's standing from him and in front of him, and she has the papers to exonerate him that she's going to sign. And she said, Mr. Spencer, I want to be the first person to shake your hand as a fully exonerated innocent man. And someone goes, and then there's silence. And she goes, you all can clap. And the place
we usually
goes
don't
wild.
clap in courtrooms, but yeah.
And so the place goes wild. But let me tell you one other thing about Ben, how he used his time. He was able to give a statement, and it's not in the book. And so I brought what he said here. Remember, Jeffrey Young was a victim. He says that not only, he reminded everyone that he, Ben, and his family weren't the only victims of the justice system. And then he said, quote, but the Young family were victims as well because they lost a loved one. And the person who was actually responsible for what happened to Jeffrey Young was not brought to justice. So I'd ask that you pray for the Young family and be mindful of them in this matter because they still lost a loved one. So I don't want them to be forgotten in this. That's how he used his time.
Was he ever compensated by the state for his wrongful conviction? Can you tell us a little bit about
He was, and it happened really quickly because everyone was working on it hard. He was compensated so here's one really interesting thing. Guess which is the best state in the country when it comes to putting in guardrails and compensating people and letting people get back into court if they believe they're wrongly convicted?
I'm going to be non-judgmental here and say Texas.
Yes. Not every state can be as progressive as Texas.
That may be the first time that phrase has ever been uttered in all of history. I'm sorry to my friends in Texas. I didn't mean that.
Yes. So Texas has the most generous compensation. They give $80,000 a year for every year you've been wrongly convicted. And that in a lump sum. So he got $2.7 million about a month later. And they do $80,000 a year every year for basically it'll be the duration of his life, the next 34 years, plus free health care. So he is compensated, but no one, think of it, years 22 to 56, those are like the best years of your life. He didn't see his son grow up. He didn't, so this is no one. He would much rather have been free all of that time than to have this. But at least Texas is trying to do the right thing. Here's the thing about Ben. He still goes to work every day. He works, he got a job. He couldn't get a job loading and unloading trucks at Walmart because he had this, conviction hanging over him. So there was a man who believed in him, a billionaire named Craig Hall, and he owned a building, and he offered Ben a job being a facilities engineer, parking attendant, engineer at his building. And so Ben loves going to work. And so even though he's got all this money, he goes to work every day. He loves it.
So I've got so many follow-up questions, but I want to start with this one. Did Gladys ever recant, come clean, modify her account?
No, she never did. And
but you tried.
I actually talked to her, and and Jim McCluskey talked to her. She refused. She told me she had, a problem, dementia, she couldn't remember anything. She told Jim that, no, she didn't have anything to do with it. The DA Crusoe went to her home, and her granddaughter said she was unavailable. The DA's like, I'm the district attorney of Dallas. I'm sorry, she's unavailable. So he never got to her. She's never recanted. So no, she hasn't.
Okay. So not too long ago, I had the pleasure and the good fortune of coming to a book event in Washington, D.C., and I got to meet Ben, and I got to meet Deborah. Deborah and I sat and had a wonderful conversation about some of what she has been through. The Attorney General of the United States came and spoke and shook Ben's hand. And how are Ben and Deborah doing now? And what is the next chapter in what you and Ben are now doing?
There's a kind of funny story that I just want to say about that book party. I didn't know the Attorney General was going to be there. And so, I talk a little bit, but I basically interview Ben at this book party. And afterwards, everyone wants to come and see him. And I see this man walking through the crowd. And I'm like, whoa. And he comes and he stands in front of Ben and me. And I say, Ben, this is Attorney General Merrick Garland. And Ben says, I know that, Barb. I watch the news. So they talked. That Merrick Garland actually cried. And I mean, not tears streaming down his face, but like watering, his eyes watering. And he apologized twice for what had been done to Ben. It was, if you think about it, 4 years earlier, Ben had been in prison with no prospect of getting out. And here was the Attorney General of the U.S. apologizing to him. It was pretty amazing. And so now Ben has done incredibly well. There's been no adjustment period. You hear about prisoners, even exonerees, having a hard time. They don't know how to use a fork and knife because they've been using sporks. They don't know. They ask permission for everything. Can I go to the bathroom now? Can I go for a walk? They're used to. They've been institutionalized. None of that with Ben. And I remember standing outside on his doorstep the day after he was released in 2021, and it's a beautiful Dallas day in March, and you hear the lawnmowers and you see people walking their dogs. And I'm like, Ben, what is this like for you? And he goes, Barb, this is a life I should have been living, and now I'm living it. Seems normal. It seems normal. So now Ben tells the story from the inside up to, how he's wrongly kind of accused and arrested and all that, and prison life. And I can tell the story from the outside, what it took, why he was in there, and what it took to get him out. So we're going to law schools. We're actually going to churches because his is a story of faith. And I'd like to go to district attorneys. We're going to law schools because these are the future legislators and prosecutors. These are people who can actually make a difference in the future because the system is fixable. There are, Texas is an example of that. They have put in guardrails. So we want to talk to law students. We want to talk to prosecutors and DAs and maybe even federal prosecutors, although that's, they don't handle most of the violent crimes. And churches, and we're actually getting some traction. We've been to WashU, we're going to Notre Dame, we're going to GW. Harvard is talking about having us. We're going to Williams, my alma mater. I mean, these are just things that are coming about. So what we're hoping is to get this message out about it's so easy to convict an innocent person, and it's so hard to get them out. And if people knew, it's like Rosa Parks, it's like George Floyd. If there's a problem, that's theoretical. But if there is a human who embodies the problem, the injustice, like a Rosa Parks or a George Floyd, suddenly it becomes relatable. And Ben embodies the problems of how the system can go off the rails. And so I think he has a really powerful story.
And when we hear these powerful stories, and that's obviously the focus of the book, Bringing Ben Home, but there are other accounts of wrongful convictions, right? If we don't work our tails off to try to fix what we know is broken, what does it say about us?
Right.
And I, for one, can tell you, we don't put enough effort and energy and resources into reform, even though the problem is basically beating us over the head. That's something that I think we need to work on, and something that stories like Ben's has told so beautifully. And one of the things I wanted to say is when I read your book, there is a parade of horribles that you lay out in the book with respect to police misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct, conduct and decisions by judges that, let me put this nicely, is clearly at odds with the evidence. And yet, the way you tell the story, you're not condemning these people. I wanted to yell and scream at them as my blood pressure rose when I read your account of what some of these prosecutors, let me talk about my fellow prosecutors, engaged in and indulged and failed to do. But I'm not going to say you tell the story in a way that seems to be somewhat forgiving of all of that, but you do talk about how it's understandable how police and prosecutors and judges want to hold people accountable for particularly violent crimes, and the mother of all crime will always be murder. And they do get tunnel vision, and they get confirmation bias, and they explain away what to us outside observers is clearly exculpatory. It's Brady evidence. It's something that should be given to the defendant. And the balance you strike, I think, makes the book all the more impactful because you don't seem to be judging anybody. You're just telling the story in a way that I think brings to our attention in almost a non-judgmental way the problems we need to tackle, we need to take on. And I hope we have it in us to take them on. A couple of notes that I jotted as we've been talking.
Thank you.
One is I always tried to tell my homicide prosecutors when I was chief of homicide at the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, we had about 30 homicide prosecutors at a time assigned to handle all of the murder cases in Washington, DC. And we had a lot of movement through the section and attrition. So I don't know how many homicide prosecutors I supervised over the years, but I always tried to tell them, we are never more vital in our role, our responsibilities as prosecutors, as when we are declining to bring a charge.
Yeah.
Because even if you know in your gut the person committed the offense, if you don't have enough reliable, admissible evidence, you have to decline to bring a charge. And let me tell you, you will upset people when you decline to bring a charge. You'll upset the victim if there's a surviving victim. You'll upset the victim's family if it's a homicide case. You may upset the community. You may upset, large swaths of people, but you're never more vital than when you are declining to bring a charge for the right reasons. Similarly, when we bring charges, I knew I was going to make a lot of people unhappy. The offender, maybe the offender's criminal associates, maybe the offender's family and community. I always found it very liberating, knowing that no matter what prosecutorial decision I made, I was going to make a whole bunch of people unhappy. That just gave me the luxury of making the decision based on the facts and the law and nothing else. And that's where we need to be as a criminal justice system, from the federal system to the local prosecutors. And I hope we have it in us, and I hope we can marshal enough folks who feel the same way about equal justice that we can begin to have an impact moving forward.
I agree. I also want to mention there is an image that is seared in my mind that for me captures one of the main messages of the book of Ben's experience, and that is serendipity. Ben and Deborah got married on January 10th, 2022. It was what would have been their 35th anniversary. And 500 people came to the service, even though it was in the middle of COVID. And I was standing at the back of the church. And I could look up at the altar. And what you saw on the altar were Ben and Deborah, her bridesmaids, and then his groomsmen. And when you looked at those men, 5 of them, including Ben, had been in prison. 4 of them had been wrongly convicted. What that told me is those men, those 4 men, and Ben, were the luckiest of the unlucky. They were unlucky because they were wrongly convicted. They were lucky because, in Ben's case, Centurion Ministries came, spent $250,000 on his case. 2 of Texas's best lawyers came along and donated their time pro bono. The Atlantic came along. NPR came along, reinvestigated the case. He was exponentially lucky because a new district attorney came in and with a prosecutor who wanted to reinvestigate the case. He was exponentially lucky. He was the luckiest of the unlucky. But it raises the question, in America, should a person's freedom depend on luck?
And putting my prosecutor's hat back on, I know we have made enormous progress, certainly on the forensics, the science, the technology. So, for example, when I started prosecuting back in the 80s, we didn't have DNA technology. We had fingerprints, and the reality is we almost never got usable latent fingerprints. We would have, for example, a vehicular homicide case, and we would dust, not we, but the evidence technicians would dust, the rear view mirror and the door handle and the steering wheel. We never got usable latent fingerprints. Now you know what we do. When we have a vehicular homicide, we will go right to the airbag and we will swab the airbag, because whoever was driving at the moment of impact, assuming the airbag deployed, that person left their epithelial cells, their skin cells all over that airbag. We've made enormous progress, which has helped guard against wrongful convictions. And decades ago in Washington, D.C., we enacted the Innocence Protection Act, which gives every defendant, regardless of their means, an opportunity to test any piece of evidence. I'm taking liberties with the exact language of the IPA. The law basically gives them the opportunity to test any item of evidence they think might be relevant, might be probative of guilt or innocence. So we've made enormous strides. The science has come forward light years. I'd like to think the people who populate the system have also moved forward light years in their determination, not just to convict the guilty, but more importantly, to protect the innocent and to right wrongs when those wrongs are brought to our attention. I think we do better year after year. Boy, we have a long way to go. And your book highlights that. And I cannot thank you enough or tell you how inspired I've been by your book and the lessons that I think people should learn. I think I may have told you, if I were still chief of homicide, I would make this book not necessarily mandatory reading, because I don't think I could, assign books to my prosecutors. But boy, as chief, I would say, I strongly encourage you to read it. And Barb, I strongly encourage everybody to read it, whether or not you're conversant in or even interested in the criminal justice system, because, this is about real life, and it is as sort of gut-wrenching and ultimately, in many ways, rewarding as a book gets. So I can't thank you enough for writing the book, for taking up Ben's cause, and then for being here and talking us all through what bringing Ben home really involved. So I thank you.
This was really, really meaningful. Thank you so much.
Okay, Barb. And let me just one more time say that the book, Bringing Ben Home, is available on Amazon and I'm sure elsewhere. But what I'll do is I will put a link to where people can purchase this book in the description of the video. And with your permission, I'd also like to put in the description of the video some of the dates and locations of where people can see you and Ben making presentations, because I know you have some of those set in the near term. And I have a feeling some people would love to see you and Ben talk about these experiences live. So I'll also put those in the description of the video. And the last thing I want to say, and Barb might not be wildly comfortable with this, but Bringing Ben Home is on the list of Amazon's best books of 2024 and also on the best books list of the Christian Science Monitor. All the more reason to get a copy. I promise you, you will not regret reading Bringing Ben Home.
Thank you.